I closed yesterday's podcast by saying we'll probably get to that tomorrow, and I'm talking about the reason why the Apostle Paul believed that we needed to give towards the needs of the saints in Jerusalem. And then I looked at my notes and I thought, you know what? I don't think I'm going to get to that until Monday. So bear with me. The Apostle Paul is talking about taking an offering, and again, he talks about taking an offering, and the very first thing that he mentions is the grace of God. Now, what's he doing? We would call this, in those of us that study and interpret the scriptures, an umbrella phrase. The grace of God needs to cover the giving of every offering. And what it does is it helps our abilities. It helps us to give beyond. It helps us to give with joy. It helps us to give with our own accord. And now in verse number 5, 2 Corinthians, the 8th chapter, verse number 5, and says, and this. In other words, Paul is adding to the things that the grace of God helps us to do in our giving. And this, not as we had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord. What's the key in taking an offering? The key is this: giving yourself to the Lord. You know, we don't hear much about the Lordship of Christ in many of our churches. What does it mean, giving yourself to the Lord? What's the Lord? When you say Lord, what are you actually saying? You're saying he's the boss. You're saying that you're the one that's in control of my life. How many of you know that when you confess Jesus as Lord, then you're saved? When you believe in your heart and confess him as Lord, then you're saved. You see, we need to understand that we as believers live under the lordship of Jesus. And so the Apostle Paul is telling us these Macedonian Christians, they understood, they gave themselves to the Lord. I believe that's one thing that needs to be stressed. When we give in an offering, that we first of all give ourselves to the Lord. We say, Lord, what do you want us to give? You know, many times people just throw the tithe in the offering bucket, and they don't ever pray, and they don't ever say, Lord, what do you want us to give? Now, let me just say this. I believe the tithe is something that every believer needs to be doing, starting with the 10th, but definitely not ending with the 10th of what you've got. Lord, what do you want us to give? You know, when you have a need at the church, and the church needs extra money over and beyond the tithe, which is given for the building of the church, which is given for the paying of the bills of the church. And they say, hey, we've got a need. You know what you need to do is you need to say, Lord, you're Lord. You're the boss. You're in control of everything I have. You are in the control of me. I'm giving myself to you. What do you say? And then the Apostle Paul in verse number 5 says, and to us by the will of God. The Macedonian church gave to the Apostle Paul, and notice he didn't say gave to me, he said gave to us. He's talking about not only himself, but he's talking about the men who traveled with him, and he's talking about the saints that were in Jerusalem. They gave to us by the will of God. In other words, they did what God wanted them to do. So let me encourage you to do this. When your pastor gets up or when a missionary comes and he says, we have this need, don't just blow it off. Don't just say, well, I give my tithe. say this prayer: Lord, what do you want me to give? Oh, you want me to give my car? Well, Lord, I'll do it with your grace. Oh, you want me to give that $1,000 that I've been saving for something? Lord, I'm doing it according to your grace. I'm doing it according to your will. You see, when people follow the will of God, they experience the grace of God. Do you understand? When you say, God, I'll do what you want me to do, you know what? The grace of God comes in. I've traveled to many countries of the world, and people say, well, how do you do that? How do you go to such impoverished areas? How do you do that? Well, you do it by saying, God, what's your will? Do you want me to go there? Then you experience the grace of God to go. Now, let's move on. Talking again about offerings. I get a little sidetracked, but I think it's good. Verse number 6. So we urged Titus that as he had previously made a beginning, so he would also complete in you this gracious work as well. What's Paul saying? Titus had already had a beginning with the Corinthians. He had already had a relationship with the Corinthians. The Corinthian church was not being asked to give to a stranger. They were being asked to give to Titus, who had lived with them. He had been with them. The Apostle Paul himself had been for a long period of time, had lived with the Corinthians. But Paul is saying, so we urge Titus that as he had previously made a beginning, and then what did he urge us? So that he would also complete in you this gracious work as well. You see, the Apostle Paul was sending Titus to go and collect this offering. The Apostle Paul knew that Titus would and could take the offering. He knew he was a man that he could trust. He knew the Corinthians could trust him because he had lived with them. Paul is talking about this, taking this offering from the Corinthians. And so he says, so he would also complete in you this gracious work. Now notice again, he goes back to the grace of God. This is a work of grace. Listen to me, please. Taking an offering needs to be, first of all, a work of the grace of God in a person's life. Not the work of greed. Not the work of trying to manipulate people to give. But it's a work of the grace of God. It's a work knowing that the favor of God is resting upon you, and that no matter what your circumstances are, that grace is going to help you to give. That grace is going to help you to continue. That grace is going to abound in your life as you obey the will of God. So the Apostle Paul goes back and he says, this is a work of grace. Thank you for listening to us this week. Join us again next week as we continue our study in the book of 2 Corinthians.